Welcome to Deathly Honest, the podcast where we get real about the parts of life we often avoid: aging, death, and grief. Here, we strip away the cliches, drop the euphemisms, and dive into the truths most people keep at arm's length. This isn't just a place for somber reflections. It's a raw, profound, and sometimes darkly humorous exploration of the journey we all face. Whether it's tackling the messy emotions that come with loss, confronting the fears around mortality, or finding a laugh in life's most challenging transitions, Deathly Honest is here to make these conversations easier, one episode at a time. So grab your favorite beverage, a box of tissues, and your most beloved comfort item, and let's get deathly honest together. Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 1 of Deathly Honest. If you haven't listened to episode 0 yet, you might want to go back and do that just to get an idea of what the podcast is all about and a little bit about me, but it's not a must-have. You can work your way right into episode 1 if you would like. Episode 1 is my first storytelling episode with a guest, and I don't know that I could have picked anyone better than Leanna. She did such a beautiful job of telling the story of her dad and walking through the process of his cancer and his ultimate death. If you have walked this walk yourself, I think this will really resonate with you. Perhaps you're walking it now, and Leanna has some good pieces of advice for people who are maybe walking this now. And this is, she embodied what I had hoped for in this podcast, which is the telling of stories and sharing our stories and speaking of these experiences with aging, with dying and death and grief. Leanna's story is really about the dying and death part. And she just did it so beautifully. So I hope that you are able to sit down and grab yourself some Kleenex and your comfort items. And maybe you have to stop. It's a long podcast. Maybe you have to stop now and then, take a break, do that. Take good care of yourself while you're doing this. And then you come back. The guest episodes are going to be longer because I don't know how you shorten the stories. And they'll be intermixed with some podcasts that are just me sort of talking about these topics around aging and death and dying and grief. But for today, I hope you can get yourself something comfy and sit and take really good care of yourself as you make your way through this. Maybe afterwards, you can hop on over to my YouTube page and do a yoga or a yoga nidra for grief. Those notes will be in the podcast notes if you want to go over and do some of that. This really is about you taking care of you. So please do that as you're walking your way through these podcasts. And I look forward to hearing from you and giving me your feedback about how you feel about these stories. And if you happen to have a story yourself that you'd like to tell, please reach out to me. All of that information will be in the podcast notes as well. So I look forward to hearing from you, and I hope that you take really good care of yourself while you sit and listen to this beautiful episode. Take good care. Hi, Leanna. Welcome to Deathly Honest. I am so grateful to have you here as my very first guest. You and I have known each other a long time. I was thinking about it this morning. I was trying to figure out when I started teaching childbirth classes with your mom, and I realized it was almost 23 years ago because I was immediately postpartum with Christopher, my youngest, and he just had his 23rd birthday. So that blew my mind this morning. I was like, 23 years. So I was teaching childbirth classes with your mom, and then I knew of you then because obviously your mom talked about you. And then at some point, you had a baby, and I was honored enough to be your birth doula for your daughter. And she's how old?
She's 13, going to be 14 in May.
Okay. Yeah. So it's been a long time, right? We've known each other a long time. And then I don't even remember when you and I started seeing each other, in my counseling office, if it was postpartum sometime.
Yes, it was
Yeah.
with Maverick. So my
Okay.
son just turned 10. So it would have
Okay.
been during that time is when I
Okay.
suffered with
Yeah.
anxiety
So
and postpartum, all the things. So
all
yes.
the fun stuff that comes from being human and having babies and all the things. And you have done, so here's the thing with you is that you have done so much work on yourself. And we're going to talk about your experience with your dad and his death today.
Mhm.
And it's been almost 6 months since he died.
Yes.
Okay.
It'll be
I Go ahead.
yeah, it'll be right about 6 months in a few
Okay.
weeks. So
I probably wouldn't have someone on 6 months after somebody died. But I feel like you and I have talked about it a lot. And because you've done so much work on yourself as a human being, I think
mhm.
that you were able to process through this in maybe a different way than had it been 10 years ago, or I don't know. I just feel like you are walking your way through this. You are truly doing the grief part of this. So my ideal for you is that we do this podcast today. It's going to be episode 1 of Deathly Honest. And if Deathly Honest continues on, um, my hope is like a year from now, you'll come back and share what it's like 18 months out versus 6. Because I think that could be a really interesting thing for other people to listen to, So if you're interested,
I absolutely am. And I'm honored to be your first guest. Kelly, thank you so much for having me.
I'm thrilled to have you here. So I'm going to, this is a storytelling podcast. So it's your story.
Mhm.
And I don't have any ideas or rules or anything about how this should go. It's your story. The goal is that I just am opening up this space so people can tell their stories about aging, about death and grief and dying and all of those kind of things, and just have other people be able to hear stories that maybe resonate with them or allow them to have some feelings, whatever it might be. So I'm going to kind of let you take it away a little bit and just kind of start wherever you want to start. I know that your dad died from cancer.
Mhm.
And we were talking a little bit before we started recording that it was almost exactly 3 years ago that you
Mhm.
guys started this process and he was diagnosed. Do you want to start there and what that process was like for you when he was diagnosed? And first of all, tell me your dad's name.
My dad's name is
Okay.
David.
It's
Mhm.
really important to me that
Yep.
we name the loved ones in our lives who have died. And so I knew your dad, a little bit. I met him a few times, so I was honored enough to be able to meet him. So yeah, start wherever you want to start, but, give us a little bit of the backstory of his cancer and what that process was like for you guys.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So yeah, almost 3 years ago, well, actually 3 years ago, just last month is when my dad officially had gotten diagnosed with abdominal cancer. So peritoneal adenocarcinomatosis was the official name.
How long did it take you to learn how to say that?
Uh, I don't know. I've come from a medical background.
That's right.
Not that long.
Okay.
But we were kind of thrown into the throes of trying to figure out what it is and what that meant, because
Right.
he was having some abdominal pain and bloating, and some pain several months prior to his official diagnosis.
Sure.
And so once he got diagnosed, they said, this is stage 4, it's metastasized, we don't know from where. And to this day, we still never knew where it started from. So there was no originate point in his body, which does make it a little frustrating because you don't know, like, where did it start and things that you can do to avoid things in the future for other family members. But
Right.
so my dad, once we got diagnosed, there was several oncology and second opinions and third opinions, because as you know, everybody has a different thought regarding cancers and treatments. And this person will tell you that this other person's way is wrong and vice versa. So
Absolutely.
It was kind of trying to weigh down the road of, okay, what's going to be best for, him. And of course, my mom and dad were, making those hard choices.
Right.
Basically the timeline for what they considered, living or death, so to speak. The outcome was almost the same whether he went with chemo or he didn't go with chemo.
Okay.
And so he opted to not do the chemo route. He had friends and other family members that had done chemo, and it just didn't seem like a good fit, nor did he live the 2 years that they, kind of expected him to live with chemo, in that with the side effects that can come along with that.
Right.
And so he basically, did a lot of different holistic things. He was doing IV vitamin C. He worked with the Seattle Integrative Cancer Center.
Okay.
And so they took a very conservative approach, but they still wanted to do chemo at that point. But my dad was kind of resolute that, hey, if I'm going to live 2 years, this is where I want to have a good quality of life. And overall, he did. But there was every day, was sacrifices for my mom. There was doctor's appointments, like IV vitamin C, blood draws. He was doing acupuncture and hyperbaric chamber and all kinds of, different supplements that the cancer doctor had recommended, as well as kind of an oncologist, naturopath, so to speak. Yeah. And so, it was still revolved around lots of doctor's appointments, lots of that kind of stuff. About a year into things, my dad was hospitalized with a partial obstruction in his bowels. And at that point, he had to go completely 100% without any type of food. So he went to a complete liquid diet at that point. So his last year plus, a month or so, was on 100% liquid diet. Wow. So he was juicing vegetables and doing really well. Like his weight, they were able to stabilize his weight. He did lots of, bone broths and gelatin, because that's still considered like a clearish liquid. And so he was able to, still get his nutritional needs met. But, think of what our lives revolve around food.
The enjoyment of food. And can I ask you really fast? I'm going to stop you for just a second so I can ask, how old was your dad?
He was 67 when he was diagnosed.
Which is very young, right? Yeah. Like really young. Yeah.
Was he maybe just turned 68.
Okay.
Because, now that it's been 6 months. So he died a month before he turned 70.
Okay. Yeah. So which is super young. Yeah. Right.
So I don't feel like that's very old.
No. And your parents were married for how long when he died?
They're
sorry. Put you on the spot. Sorry.
I think because he died right before their anniversary, which was September. Oh, Mom, don't kill me. I think it's September 8th. I always mix it up between the 8th or the 9th. And I think it would have been 45 years, 46.
Wow. Yeah. So that's a long time to be together too. And this had to have completely changed their lives, It
did. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And my mom, as you know, but listeners might not, and my mom's a nurse.
Right.
So she retired a couple years ago, or a few years ago, back in 21, I believe it was. And so basically she went from nursing and taking care of, pregnant mamas and things like that at a women's clinic to basically taking care of my dad.
Yep.
And my dad was not an invalid. He did a lot of he juiced all this stuff for himself. My mom didn't have to do much in terms of like actively care for him, but a nurse is always a nurse. So, her life.
Very true. My mother was also a nurse. So very true.
Then just very caring natured. So, once he switched to, a liquid diet, he was stable for the most part, but the pain kept increasing and the cancer kept, I don't want to say it spread because it still stayed throughout his abdomen, which was mostly through the omentum, which is kind of this fatty layer that holds your organs kind of where they're supposed to be. And so it wasn't inside his colon or intestines, but it was all throughout the outside of that space.
Yeah.
And, the doctor, one of the oncologists, he described it as, like that bubble wrap where there's all those little bubbles and you can pop them and they make that little pop sound. They described the nodules or the cancer as the bubble wrap. So every little dot was a nodule or a cancer. So it was just all throughout the abdomen.
Yeah.
And so surgery wasn't an option. So they had ruled that out really quickly in the beginning.
Sure.
And so basically my dad was, a man of faith, just believing that God would heal him and just give him as much time that he was supposed to have here on this earth. And, pain would increase, and, with it would come more pain meds. And, but it was a struggle because the cancer made the intestines like glue. So our intestines are free floating inside our abdomen, and it would cause the intestines to stick together. So our intestines, look like a ribbon essentially. And so then those ribbon layers would stick together, which it would cause paralysis. So then you wouldn't get that peristalsis movement to move the bowels through there. So he had to go to great efforts to make sure things kept moving. Obviously, if you can't poop, it's not ideal.
Yeah.
And so, a lot of it was just managing that and pain, all the while continuing with, the juicing and the supplements. And so it was a long journey,
Yes. Yes. And were you living in Eastern Washington at the time?
Yes.
Yes. Your parents are in Western Washington. And so it was, how much were you traveling back and forth?
So initially, I was trying to go every 4 to 6 weeks.
Okay.
I would try and go back over there. I wouldn't bring the kids every single time. Sometimes it would just be me popping over for a weekend just to spend as much time because, you just never knew how things were going to go.
Yep.
And, it was lots of great memories. I have lots of great, memories of just popping over there and visiting. But we at least thankfully had to have these tough conversations. We were able to get wills in order.
Good.
We were, my mom has her sisters too as a great support system. And then my dad's family as well is a big support system. But so we were able to kind of, what's it going to look like if, if and when things,
Yeah. And your parents were open to having those conversations. Your dad was okay having those conversations, and
he was
good.
We started having them, but it probably wasn't until after he was hospitalized and went to a complete liquid diet that we were like, okay, this is it. Now this is serious because you can only live so long on liquids too. I mean, and we knew that it was a matter of time before the bowels would sort of block or just wouldn't move. And actually, that's what landed him in the hospital before he died. It was a complete and total bowel obstruction. So there was no more, nothing was moving through his system. And so that is ultimately what landed him back in the hospital.
So take me back for just a second.
Yeah.
Those conversations was it you and your mom and dad? Was your husband involved? Was your brother involved? What kind of conversations were you guys having about all this?
It was definitely mom, dad, my brother. I have a twin brother. And so we were absolutely involved. Our spouses, were involved in more of like a supporting role in terms of, we did have a lot of like, okay, what do we need to do in terms of the wills and power of attorney and, for life insurance purposes and things like that. So those conversations were very much, had got things, lined out. And then further along, then the harder conversations was about, burials or, cremations. And actually we had those conversations, which we were blessed to be able to have them. And I say blessed because a lot of people, you might lose a loved one suddenly and you don't get a chance to have these conversations. But my dad was very involved when we were talking about his memorial service.
Good.
Before he got to the point where he was unresponsive. So when he was first hospitalized, we were able to talk about, what would it look like for, if we did a memorial service. He didn't actually have much opinion too much one way or the other. And when he wanted to be cremated, he didn't think that it was necessary to be buried. But we were able to talk about it openly and,
lovely.
And so it was good and bad, right? I mean, you don't want to ever have those conversations, but when you have some preparation, it takes a lot of the fear out. And
It's
then you're
beautiful.
not scrambling trying to go, okay, my loved one has passed away. Now what do I do?
Yes.
And
Yes.
it's also given my husband and I, and I'm sure I can't speak for my brother, but I'm sure my brother and his wife, some hard conversations about like what we want if we're at this spot. And, and so it does open the dialogue to be able to have those conversations, and they're uncomfortable and they're hard, and you don't ever want to have them. But when you are prepared, it does take a lot of that fear.
Well, and you knew after your dad died, you guys did what you knew he wanted. Yeah. You didn't have to go, you sit around and talk about, do you think he wanted to be buried? Do you think he wanted to be cremated? You knew. And it makes it, this is all hard. None of this is simple, but it makes it easier to not have to consider, what do we think he wanted? Yeah. You knew you did what he wanted. That was easy, and you didn't have to spend too much time agonizing over it, in a really difficult time.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm going to ask you really fast. How old are you?
I'm 42.
Okay. So this is a beautiful thing. You have a 13 and 10-year-old?
Yes.
Is that right? Yeah.
Yep.
And so, there is something beautiful in that, in you and your husband going, we should probably have some of these conversations and make sure we are as prepared as we can be. Mm-hmm. None of us know when we're going to die. Hopefully you guys live a long, long, long time. But there is something beautiful in that when you go through something like this, that you kind of spend some time going, oh yeah, we're also going to die.
Yeah.
So what do we want to do? So that's beautiful. That's actually really beautiful. So when he went into the hospital with the bowel obstruction, when was that?
So that was in August, I think it was July 31st.
Of last year, of 2024.
Of last year,
yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
But actually, he was hospitalized in June.
Okay.
June 1st of that same year, 2024, last year, for a partial obstruction.
Okay.
They had thought it was a complete obstruction. So we actually thought that we were at the very end back in June.
Oh, wow.
And at that point, the bowel obstruction, it turned into a partial. So things were still able to move through there, but very, very small. And so he was in the hospital for 2 weeks. He actually got out on Father's Day. So I was there for that, those 2 weeks. And at that point is when, because they knew that he couldn't take in enough fluids orally to stay hydrated, because of the partial obstruction. Right. So, I mean, they were, he would take a sip of water or tea or juice or broth, and it was a sip or two every half hour to an hour. But that's not enough to even give you enough fluids to be hydrated.
Right.
And so at that point is when they decided to put him on TPN, which is total parental nutrition. And it's basically just an IV nutrition. They draw labs and then mix up a formula with vitamins, minerals, and fats. And so he was actually on that. So, it did extend a little bit of time that we were able to have with my dad.
Was that continuous? Was that a continuous?
It wasn't. It was a 12-hour cycle.
Okay.
So when he first started it, they had to go really, really slow. And I think it was an 18-hour cycle.
Okay.
But then it got to where it was like 7 at night to 7 in the morning. Or 8 and 8. I can't remember which time frame. My mom probably would know.
Yeah. So he had a permanent.
He had a port.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So he had opted for the port. I want to say right after he got out of the hospital, the first time. Okay. A year into the die. Maybe it wasn't quite a year. He had opted for a port because they were having a hard time getting veins. They were collapsing. He was getting weekly IV vitamin C, sometimes twice a week. And so because of that, he did opt to have the port. And my God, was I thankful that, especially towards the end, that we had that available. It definitely can make or break, having somebody.
It does. I mean, at the end of someone's life, it's impossible to get veins, right? That kind of thing is nearly impossible. And so was your mom doing some of this then at home when he came home that first time? Okay.
Yeah, they had a nurse come in and she would draw labs at home. And then my mom, it was basically, clean the port line and do that. So yes, she was able to do that. And so he was, And, all the while, they were still encouraging him to try and take in some liquids because
Sure.
even though he was getting the IV nutrition, if you stop taking in things orally,
Yeah.
it does shut things down.
Right.
Our bowels are designed to have things come in and then go out the other end.
Yes.
And so they wanted him to continue having liquids and things. And, my dad had a little portable backpack, so he was still able to, go to church and Bible studies if, depending on, how late it was.
Yep.
Because like I said, it was a 12-hour cycle.
Yep.
So he, yeah.
How did he handle all of that from your perspective?
I am surprised at how well he did handle it because, my dad was the cook in the family. He loved to cook and he loved to make, he pretty much would make the meals for my mom and dad. Growing up, he did most of the cooking when we were younger. So he just loved to cook. So, I just admired how much he did handle, just taking it in stride and making the changes that he had to make. I mean, the choice was sort of taken away from him in that, you have to go to liquid diet. Okay. Right. But he did try and make the very best of it. And I think the rest of us, we would always feel incredibly guilty, because we would get together for dinners with family. And I mean, we have to eat.
You weren't all juicing for dinner every time you went over. Yeah.
It definitely made it like, I think we felt more guilty about it than he did. But there was sometimes I remember where, like, if we would be eating, sometimes he would sit at the table with us. And then I think sometimes he would just sit on the couch or on his recliner and he would do like red light therapies and he had a little red light blanket.
Yeah.
And he would do some other therapies that he was doing. So sometimes he would take while we were eating, he would just go do that.
Sure.
So still, within earshot of our conversations, but
not watching you eat, maybe.
But not watching us eat. Yeah. But a lot of times, he would have his Jello or his broth and, sit there while here we're eating like, steak or taco salad. And, he definitely missed it. And actually on his deathbed, we talked a lot about food and, he just kept saying, we just kept telling him and he would say, I hope there's, good food in heaven because he hadn't had food a long time without actual food.
Yes.
And just the nature to want to just chew,
Of course. Yeah.
So
yeah,
I think that he took it in stride. There was definitely ups and downs, especially when they would check cancer markers and sometimes the numbers would go up.
Yeah.
And then he would always go through kind of this phase of it's getting worse, this is going to be it. But then, then the cancer markers would drop.
Right.
And then he would be like, this is all working. And we were really hoping that a lot of these natural therapies would help. And I do think that they helped in terms of it never spread anywhere else.
Yeah.
It very easily could have spread to his lungs, his liver, other organs, and it didn't. It stayed in the omentum.
Okay.
And so, I mean, it did enough damage.
Sure. Yes.
But it didn't spread. So I think that overall, the quality of life was pretty darn good. Obviously, towards the end, especially after that first hospitalization in June, the pain was getting a lot stronger.
Sure.
And he had a great primary care doctor that really worked with him on pain management.
Good.
And so that was, they used that term palliative care. And palliative and hospice kind of get used interchangeably.
Yes.
But he was on palliative care for the better part of the year prior to him dying because they were just really trying to manage making sure that he stays hydrated. Oh, and he would get fluids along with the vitamin C because sometimes there just wasn't enough. He just couldn't get enough in orally.
Yes. Yes. And I think that, to your point, palliative care and hospice, they are two very different things, even though they are often related and often people see both as they are going through that process of dying. Because palliative care really is about making people comfortable with whatever it is that they're dealing with, where hospice is also keeping people comfortable, but it is very much, we are at the end of life kind of thing, or, preparing for end of life. And it can be months on hospice. It can be, people have been on hospice for more than, a year more, that it can be, because we don't know when people are actually going to die. But yes, I think you're right. There is a difference between the two of them. And, and you did have hospice towards the end, or no?
We didn't, because he was hospitalized with the bowel obstruction.
Okay. That makes sense.
He had to have an NG tube, which is a tube that goes in through your nose into the stomach to remove the contents. So our stomach and everything produces liters of gastric juices a day.
It's fun what our bodies do. Yeah,
I know.
Yeah.
So it would remove that, because if not, then he would have just extensive vomiting.
Yes.
And so he had the NG tube, and because he couldn't take anything by mouth, he had to be on IV pain medication.
Okay.
And they did talk about, they actually wanted to move him to an inpatient hospice facility.
Okay.
And so beginning of August, or, July 31st or August 1st, he was still with it. And I mean, very with it. He just had this bowel obstruction, which seemed very cruel, because people would come visit my dad, and he's like up visiting and chatting. And, here we know that this is it. Like, he's going to be dying.
Yes.
Because you cannot live with a bowel obstruction.
Right. Right.
And it's only a matter of time until, you just can't. Just can't.
Yes.
And so so what was I saying? So he was hospitalized, and
that was, you said July 31st, August 1st.
Yeah.
And that was the point. He didn't come home after that hospital.
Correct. Yeah. Right. So that's the very end.
Okay.
We kind of thought that this was going to be like it was back in June, right? Where the bowel obstruction that they said opened up a little bit and things were able to move through. That was not the case.
Okay.
And so then, the first week he was in the hospital, it was just confirming that the bowels were in fact blocked.
Okay.
Surgery was not an option. And then what do we do now?
Right.
And so after, lots and lots of talking with doctors and, having multiple opinions and things like that, my dad kind of, I want to say we were trying to paint the picture very clearly for my dad, because the hospital staff, the doctors were talking about the risk of the bowels rupturing.
Right.
So when there's an obstruction, the cancer is squishing them together. The likelihood of them ballooning and then rupturing is very, very high.
Right.
And we didn't want that type of a death for my dad.
Right.
We didn't want him to be totally with it. And, aside from being on the IV, drip line and the TPN.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden his bowel ruptured. So, the doctors sometimes were painting this picture of, well, it's not ideal. And we were like reading, we had to do a lot of the research ourselves.
Yes.
Like, what does this look like? How does it actually look like in a person?
Right.
And, talk about that with my dad. Like, this is what's going to happen.
Right.
So you already know that you cannot eat, you cannot drink, you have to get your fluids. And so once we talked about that, my dad did make the choice to stop the IV.
Okay.
Or again, it was through, at that point he had an IV still in his arm. So they had the port, because they wanted to leave the port in case they needed, emergency access. But like a couple weeks in, then everything went directly into the port once he blew out the vein.
Okay.
But we had to have I had a conversation with my mom's and dad's pastor. And I felt like my dad needed permission.
Mm-hmm.
He needed permission to say, you have fought the good fight. You're okay to make the choice to stop nutrition, to stop the IV fluids. And it's a hard, if you're a Christian or somebody of faith, it's hard to say, okay, I am choosing to allow myself to die, essentially.
Yes. Very much so.
That was a choice that he had to make. I mean, he could have opted to stay on the TPN.
Right.
And then his bowels would have ruptured and he would have died a very horrific, agonizing death.
Yeah.
But he chose to stop all the IV nutrition and the fluids. And so it took, we had conversations over a couple of days, really deep conversations about, you're not giving up.
Yeah.
You're just accepting that your body is failing. Your mind isn't failing you, it's your body.
Right.
And it's okay to accept that. I will say one of the doctors, Dr. Perez, he said a beautiful thing to my dad. And he said, the people that accept that this is happening, they're going to die, have the more peaceful death experiences than the people that fight it all the way to the end.
Right.
And I definitely could see how that would be very applicable. Like and we actually thought, oh my gosh, my dad's never going to get to the point of accepting this is happening.
Yeah. It's hard. It is a hard thing to do.
Yes, it is. And aside from the bowel obstruction, he was cognitively with it. His color was good. His weight was, he was on the thinner side from being on a liquid diet for a long, long time. But overall, his health was really good.
Yeah.
And so making that choice. And so it was, a conversation with their pastor, and the pastor agreeing, Dave, it's okay. You can, you're not denying that God could heal you at any time.
Right.
You're just accepting that your body is failing, and you're accepting that this is what's happening. And if God's going to call you home, he's going to call you home. Right. And, and we can go along with it, or we can dig our heels in and fight it. And it still happens either way.
Yes.
So it was a beautiful thing that he did get to that place of accepting it. So now what? Okay. Yeah. He stops at TPN. So we're all like, okay, what does this mean? Right? What does this look like?
Yeah.
And I had no idea that it would take as long as it did.
Yep.
So literally to the day that he stopped all the IV, TPN, and the nutrition, it was 2 full weeks, 14 days before he actually passed away.
Yep.
And people don't talk about how hard that is on the person dying. Obviously, I'm not trying to negate that, but the family.
Yeah. So talk about that for a second, because you live in Washington State. You live in Eastern Washington, and your parents are over here in Western Washington, and you had kind of come over and planted at that point. You were not driving back and forth. You left your husband and your 2 kids in Eastern Washington and came over to be with your mom and your dad.
Yeah.
So you were there pretty much the whole time, correct?
I was. Yeah. So August 1st until I was there. I went back home. So my dad died August 19th, and I went back home on the 21st. So yeah, I was there for 3 full weeks.
Yeah.
Well, minus 1 day. Actually, I came home August 5th for one night. I came home because when he first was hospitalized, we kind of thought, okay, he's going to be in the hospital. They're going to discharge him like they did back in June.
Right.
And so I didn't have, I'm on thyroid medication. I didn't have all of my medication.
All your things. Yes. The things that people don't really think about, right? You're like, oh, wait. This is going to be a little longer. I need, it can just be as simple as I need my contact lenses, or I need, all of those kind of things. Yeah.
There was a few things that I needed, and I had no idea that it would actually be that long. I mean, not that I wanted it to go faster or not, but you just don't think about those things. So I did. I came home after we had talked with the doctor. Maybe it was the 5th or 6th, because it was right around the time where we were talking about going off the TPN. So I came home. It was literally a 1-night turnaround. And then I left the next day, got all my things, and came back. Now, I did bring my dog with me. He's my emotional support dog.
Good.
And he had been refusing to eat the whole week I was gone. So I brought him back with me. And
because other family members, whether they are human family members or furry family members, still need things from you, even when someone is dying.
Yes.
Yeah.
So he ended up coming with me. And actually, that was a good break, because during the day when because I would live at the hospital. My mom literally lived at the hospital. And then I'll go back to talking about my family.
Yeah.
So she would stay the night every night. And then I would be there from 6 or 7 in the morning until 8 or 9 at night. And so I was able to leave, once or twice during the day to go home, kind of just decompress a little bit.
To your mom's home.
To my mom's home. Yes. Not my home. Yes. Right. I was at my mom's home. So yes, I left my husband and my 2 kids. Now they did come out one more time before my dad passed away. It was actually a week before he passed away. So they were able to say their actual final goodbyes, and my dad was still with it at that point. But yes, I was pretty much, at the hospital with my mom, with my dad, my brother, and just would go to my mom and dad's home to sleep, and then back at the hospital.
What were you guys doing all day at the hospital?
Oh, it felt so long. We would play games. We did crossword puzzles. Mom and I would sometimes watch a movie. Lots of visiting. My dad had tons of visitors. So there was family members, his friends. He was very involved in their church. He had a really good friend that he had made at the cancer center. And so he would come. His name was Steve. And so he would come and visit with my dad, and they would talk. Sometimes they would pray. But he had lots and lots of visitors. So sometimes that was a good excuse too.
Yes.
Like, okay, Mom, I'm going to take you home. Dad's going to visit with so-and-so. You're going to come home and take a shower, change. We'll get some, but we would have to get up in the morning, or I would pack our lunches.
Yep.
It was a lot of eating out. A lot of that kind of stuff.
Yes.
The days just crawled on, and I've never felt so torn in my life. I wanted to be there. I would never, ever not want to be where I was in the hospital with my dad, my mom, and my brother. But my family, and my kids especially had a really hard time. Like my daughter, Cammie, she had a really hard time, because she kind of stepped up and did like the mommy role. So she's, taking care of everybody and trying to make sure that, Maverick has lunches packed. Well, I guess it was the summertime, but making sure that, he had lunch stuff. And, but my heart literally felt like it was being ripped apart.
Absolutely.
Like, I would talk to them on the phone or FaceTime, and my heart wanted to be there with them, but my heart had to be where it was, nor would I not want it to be in that room with my dad. It was a very, very, it just literally did feel like my heart was breaking in two.
Yes. Yes. That's so powerful, because I do think that happens to so many people, right? Mm-hmm. Because if you have children, they're not going to spend, even if it was 2 days, they're not even going to spend 2 days at the hospital, they have to live their lives too. And you guys were quite a ways away, and there are people that do this across the country, or even further than that, right? Like their family member lives further away and they're a flight away, Mm-hmm. I think that heart being broken and kind of split in two is an absolute perfect description of that.
Yeah. So it definitely was challenging. I missed my family. I missed the normalcy of life. Like I just wanted boring life. And life is never boring, right? But I wanted that normalcy. And back to the night when I went home for that one night, mm-hmm. I remember hugging my husband, Aaron, and saying, like the next morning, and saying, I don't want to leave because I know this is the end. And when I come home, it's going to be different. My dad is not going to be alive anymore. And I wanted to hold that moment and not let it go, because I knew, okay, once I drive over both the passes, by the time I come back, it's going to be different. And at that moment, it was normal. It felt not boring, but normal. And it just was life. And so,
that's so profound.
Yeah, I didn't anyways. And then as I remember, it's like little moments. I remember driving over the passes and literally thinking to myself, okay, when I drive back the other way back home, I will not have my dad.
Yes. And it's a very, I'm glad you had those moments ahead of time, that you were able to catch that and experience it, because sometimes we don't, right? And because it is just just like you and I have this relationship of being at, your birth, it is very much that same kind of thing, right? There is this period of anticipation of what's to come. Yeah. And we don't know how long it's going to take, and we don't know what it's going to look like, but we know it's going to happen.
Yeah.
And to know that when I drive back this direction, everything is going to be different in my life. I think that's really, really profound.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm glad you had those moments for yourself, that you can remember those, even as hard as they were, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
They were hard. And, we all knew what was coming. And the 2 weeks, I kind of view the first week that my dad was in the hospital, there wasn't a lot of changes aside from, we knew that the bowel obstruction. So I really view once he had chosen to go off the TPN, those 2 weeks is kind of where things really, it just shifted because we knew, right?
Yes.
We knew that this wasn't going to continue.
Yeah, you were really just waiting at this point, which is excruciating.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it was almost, cruel because my dad was so with it. Like he would get up and he loved flowers. And so people would bring flowers, bouquets, vases of gorgeous flowers, some from their own garden. And he was up there tending them. And, if a dead one, he's picking it out. And so he had this and so it was a very kind of this mind F, if you will, because in one hand, we know, my gosh, he's really going to be dying. But then when you look at him and see him, in your head, you think, how can he be dying?
Right.
It was a really hard and awkward place to kind of see somebody at that point.
Yep.
And then the other things you don't want to talk about is you want it to go faster.
Yes.
Like you don't, and you do.
Yes.
After that second week in the hospital, they upped his pain medications quite a bit. Because with the bowel obstruction, the pain tolerance has increased. And so then he started to become more sleepy, taking more naps, a little bit more, I don't want to say agitated, but a little bit more, I don't know, I almost want to say childlike.
Yeah, when a body is dying, right? Yeah. It does change, and it does change the mind. It does. We all kind of talk about how at some point we all just go back to where we began, right? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Do you remember, was it before that time when you came into my office and sat on my couch? Do you remember what you said? The thing that I talk about sometimes. Do you remember when you came in, you literally walked into my office, you sat on the couch and you looked at me and you went, Kelli, why won't he die?
Yeah.
And that was in that moment, I'm like, yes, this is what we have to talk about, because of course you don't want him to die. You would not have wished this upon any of you.
Yeah.
But you knew he was going to die.
Yeah.
And I remember you telling that story of him. You said you walked in and he was up and attending to the flowers and you were like, what is going on?
Yes.
He's supposed to be dying and you have got this life that you have completely stopped.
Yeah.
And your children and your husband are on the other side of the mountains. And not that you don't want to be there, but you also have another life that's waiting for you to return to. And it is this very complicated emotional process of, I don't want him to die at all. And also he needs to die.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that I think is the thing that we are so afraid to say those things, right? Because you feel like, I'm not wishing him, I don't want him to die. I don't want him to die, but we know he is. And so how long do we have to do this part?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that part was longer than I ever anticipated. Yeah. I had spoken with a girlfriend and her mom had passed away 10 years prior. And she told me, no, it's going to take a couple of weeks. And I thought, there's no way. I absolutely was like, no, this can't happen. Because in your head, you think, how long can a body live?
Right.
You watch these movies and, you think a few days without fluids and dear God, you're going to die. That is not the case.
Right. Just like women whose water breaks in movies, just sit down and have a baby. Yeah. That doesn't work that way either.
It's not how it works. So yes, I do remember, saying, why won't he die? And that was a very raw, you almost felt selfish. I did feel selfish. We all felt, because we knew he was dying. We knew that there wasn't a point where he was going to come out from this.
Yes.
And we're just waiting around. And once he started becoming a little bit more, the farther along, then he wasn't responding much. So, so then we were just trying to take care of his body that's there. And he would rouse a little bit, maybe. But then we had to become his advocates.
Mm-hmm.
We had to become his advocate and say, you know, I think that he needs an extra dose of pain meds, especially if we were turning his body. Now, I'm just going to give a shout out to my mom. Like, she is a saint. She literally, you know, lived at the hospital. She did not leave his side unless I drug her away to take her home to shower and change and let's, you know, pack a lunch and go back to the hospital. The most that she would be gone from the hospital was 2 hours, maybe. So she was a saint in all of this. And, you know, even my brother, like, he would come and sit with my dad. He took a lot of time off his work too. And his family, even though they live on the west side, you know, he spent a lot of time, and he would come and sit with dad. And then I could take mom home, shower, and, you know, check on my dog and then go back. And so I really do feel like it brought us all closer together as a family too. Because especially towards the end, it was just sucky. And especially like Friday into Saturday, and then he died Monday night. But we were literally begging him, okay, Dad, you can let go. Let's go to be with Jesus. You can let go. On Wednesday night before he died, he was up for several hours in the night. And my mom would be able to articulate this a little better, but he was very agitated and he didn't want to like sit down. And my mom was trying to like, you know, okay, Dave, well, you either have to sit in the recliner or your bed. I can't stand here helping hold you up, because he would think he could stand up at that point, but he was very wobbly on his feet. And he finally was able to say, no, I'm trying to say goodbye to you. So, and my mom was like, oh, okay, well, what, you know, what's going on? And he's like, I think I'm going to die. And I'm saying my goodbye. I just want you to know I love you. And so that was Wednesday night. Now go back to Wednesday earlier in the day. He had made the choice to stop seeing visitors. So he had already come to this point. He had said that I feel like I'm looking forward to the next visit, right? The next person that I can visit with. And I have seen everybody I want to see. And I don't want to see anybody anymore. Well, his brother was driving up from Nevada, and they were going to come back and be there Thursday morning. And so I was like, well, Dad, they're coming. And he's like, I'm not going to be here. So Wednesday evening, before I went home, because visitor hours, you know, they ended at 8, but because of the situation, they let us stay until a little bit later. Well, my mom stayed the night. She was able to stay there. But he had called his sisters and FaceTimed all of them. And, you know, he said, I'm saying my goodbyes. I'm not going to, you know, have visits. And actually that was one of the harder moments, is when he got off the phone and he just started sobbing, and he was like, that was a lot harder than I thought it was going to be. You know, and we're like, harder for you. And we're just sitting there. And I can only imagine what the siblings, you know, because he called all of his siblings and FaceTimed on them. And, you know, and my dad's brother that was driving up, he was like, you know, well, we're going to be there. And my dad said, that's okay. You'll be here to support Leanna and, you know, and Chris is my mom's name, and my brother. Well, he didn't die that night. So he was convinced that he was going to pass away that night. He had kind of made his choice. This is it. I'm going to die. So when he woke up on Thursday, he was mad. He's like, why am I still here? And at that point, it almost felt like, I'm sure he started to feel like, why is this taking so long? He had made up his mind that he said goodbye. And the goodbyes that night were definitely pretty hard. And then I get a call from my mom at like 4 a.m, 4:30. And she's like, I need you to get here in the hospital. Like, just get here. So, and then I'd have to go in through the emergency room entrance. And, you know, his brother did come and he was able to see him. And that was the day that my dad they had upped pain meds again. And he was more childlike. Like I remember him fiddling with the IV bag, and he kept saying, wow. He said, wow, a lot of the times.
It is interesting.
But, and anyway, into the next day, I mean, it's kind of all blurs together, right?
Of course.
But, Friday, you know, he ended up getting No, I think mom and I had looked back. So my mom kept meticulous notes.
Of course she did.
She would journal every time a nurse, hospital person, doctor would come in. Anytime they, the IV pain meds. Now he was on a continuous drip.
Right.
Actually, I don't know if you want me to talk about that part.
Sure. You can talk about whatever you want to talk about.
So my dad was on IV pain meds because he couldn't take anything by mouth, right? I mean, he has this tube in his nose, sucking everything out of his stomach. They had talked about wanting to move him to the inpatient hospice. There was never a room available. Hospice was like, no, he's got too complicated of a case. And so finally we ended up having a doctor that just said, Dave, you're going to stay here. And I believe that was Wednesday or Thursday. But previous in the week, they had switched over to, because he was on a pain pump where he could control the pain dosage. And then he could request breakthrough medication as needed. And he had a pain patch, but the pain patches only work with your fat. So if you don't have fat on your body, it actually does it very little.
Yeah.
So even though they would up the pain patch, it didn't offer a lot of relief because, well, he was pretty thin at that point.
Right. Yeah.
And so they had switched him over to an IV automatic drip of morphine or Dilaudid.
Yeah.
And but when they first did it, they had changed the ratio. So even though he had been off fluids, anytime he would get an injection, they would have to flush the line with saline. So he was still getting some fluids.
Yes.
And when they switched over to this automatic, his actual saline or fluids actually doubled.
Yep.
And so, we were starting to look, the urine output was decreasing, the normal progression of a body dying.
Right.
And so I did a little math and I'm like, oh my gosh, the amount of fluids he's getting, because all of a sudden his urine output started increasing. And at this point he was on I don't think he had a catheter in at that point yet, but that happened a couple of days later.
Yeah.
And he was more peppy and he was like, I'm feeling pretty good. And I think that was the day where he was tending his flowers when I walked in and I was like, what the heck is happening?
Yep.
And so we had a conversation with my dad first and we said, Dad, I think you're getting a lot more fluids. And he was like, well, what do you mean? I don't want that.
Right.
And so then I said to my mom, I'm like, well, Mom, let's call the nurse and ask to talk to the doctor and see like what's going on here. And because my dad at that point, he had made the choice. He had stopped the fluid. He knew he was dying. He didn't want to be having more fluids.
Absolutely.
So then we go to talk to the doctor. So the doctor comes and he comes to talk to us. And I remember my mom was like, and my daughter has something she wants to talk to you about. I was like, oh, thanks, Mom. But I just asked the doctor, I said, okay, so just doing a little bit of math here. This is how much fluids he's actually getting just with the conversion to this automatic drip thing. Yeah. And I'm like, he's having more urine output and that's not what he wants. So here we're trying to advocate for my dad.
Yes.
But then we're basically saying you need to figure this out so he gets less fluids.
Yes.
And doctors and nurses in the hospital, bless their hearts, they're in the business of saving people.
Absolutely, they are. Yes.
And he was very honest, and he's like, I would never have even thought about this, but you're absolutely right. We need to change the dosage so he has a more concentrated, where he's getting the same amount of medication without this much fluids.
Yep. I remember you telling me the story and I thought I don't think I would have thought of that. I think lots of people would never have considered that. You have a veterinary background.
Yes.
So you do have some medical background. Your mom has some medical background. You guys have a little more information than your average family, right? Because somebody else, that could have gone on for a very long time.
Well, I suspect it would have. I mean, if they had kept that dosage, it would have sustained him enough. I mean, eventually you will die from just malnutrition.
Sure.
And kidneys and things, organs shutting down, or the bowels rupturing.
Right.
But it was a very awkward conversation.
Yeah.
And it was just kind of, so trying to be matter of fact about, hey, I just did a little math. I'm sure there's a way we can do the math to where he doesn't have this much fluids. And then, they got that adjusted very quickly.
Good.
And then things started to progress more down towards the Thursday, Friday, into Saturday. I think they placed a catheter Saturday morning. And even at that point, they don't, okay, two things. I found a YouTube video called Hospice Nurse Julie.
Yes. Yay, Hospice Nurse Julie.
She has tons and tons of videos about hospice. Now, a lot of it is in the hospice setting. Okay, that didn't really apply to us because we were in hospital because of the circumstances. Now, I think hospice would have been, if we could have had that route, I think that would have been a better fit. But my mom didn't want to be the one having to take care of my dad.
Sure.
At home. And that's what hospice, it's
absolutely
loved ones caring for the person, or if they're in like a assisted living, then you have those people stepping in to do a lot of the stuff.
Yeah, when my dad was dying, my sister-in-law and I were administering morphine, and I did not enjoy that.
No. And mom didn't really want to do that either. And so for my dad's situation and our situation, I think it worked out better that he was in the hospital just for everybody. But a lot of her videos were still very applicable. So I would go home and watch, binge watch like all these different videos about, and I'm sure if somebody looked at my browse history, how long does it take a body to die? And, those types of things, because I just needed information. I just wanted to know. And the medical staff, they would talk a little bit about it, but they wouldn't go into great detail about what it really looks like.
Right. Because we're also still scared. You were that unique family that many families are sitting in the hospital. They don't want to know all this information. Yeah. They actually just don't. They're scared, or they want people to do all the things to keep their loved one alive. That's what I think the medical staff is more accustomed to, right? Yeah. Than the family who is like, we know this is happening. We know he's going to die. Give us that information.
Yeah.
And because we still are in a society where we don't talk about it, even in the hospital.
Yeah. Well, and it's a shame. It should be more normalized and part of just conversations. And, when a person is dying, the changes that they go through and you go through, but, people don't talk about too, like, you're not going to recognize your loved one when they're actually on their very about to die. I'm not talking like when my dad first went in the hospital 3 weeks prior to him dying. Yeah. I'm talking the day he died, the day before, because as the body naturally sort of dehydrates, it changes the face structure. Absolutely. It changes. Yes. And so watching some of those videos really did help. But even then you kind of tell yourself like, well, that it can't be, like, it won't be just like that. Right. And it is. Yes. But your loved one will not look the same to you. Absolutely. And so you kind of have to just put that image that you're looking right in front of you out of your mind and think back to a year prior or whatever, because it is very skeletal looking. That's the word. Yeah. I think that is exactly the right word. It becomes very skeletal. Yeah. Skeletal. And it's just, flesh on bones, essentially. And, and just, so that I found that tool incredibly helpful, just so I could prepare myself. And even then, my dad didn't follow the exact same timeline. Of course, every person is different. Right. But I was able to kind of prepare myself a little bit more. Now, my sister-in-law, she worked at the hospital. She's a labor and delivery nurse at the hospital that my dad was at. And so she would come in a lot of times. She works nights. So she would come in before her shift and we'd be able to talk a little bit. And, she had, had talked a lot more with a friend that she had, a nurse friend that was in hospice. And so she would also talk about, okay, these are some of the steps and the phases. And I would talk with her like, okay, well, I watched this video. What do you think about that? So we were able to kind of talk about what it looks like. Yeah. But because we do live in a society that we don't talk about this stuff, right? We just don't talk about it. So you have to get that information yourself when you have a loved one dying, because we're not brought up with information about what it's like when someone is dying. Yes. And it's a shame because it's not like the movies. It's not They don't just close their eyes peacefully and die. Now, my dad didn't have like a horrific death or anything,
right?
In that regard, but just those little changes of, talking about less fluids, and then what does that actually look like when a human body isn't getting fluids?
Yes.
And our bodies are designed to not, at the very end, you don't want to have a ton of fluids in the system. That would just be terrible. But the person looks, very skeletal, and it's almost, unrecognizable. Now, again, it depends on somebody else's, what they're done or whatever. But most of the people that you get to this point of not eating for a week or two, not having fluids, they are going to look, the color will be a little bit different.
Yes.
Face will be gauntly a little bit. The mouth opens a little bit more. And because those muscles aren't there, what is that? Masticatory muscles. They're not there. The mandibles aren't there to close. And so that is something to be aware of.
I think that's beautiful information. I think that we need to talk about those things more, because it can be really upsetting when you're watching that happen.
Yeah. And so that, like I said, the videos that I watched really did help me understand like what I'm going to see. But even watching them and watching somebody else's video.
Yes. It's not yours.
It's when you see it for yourself, it's hard. It's definitely a challenge. So that was, something to consider. Another thing to just, that I'll go back to was my good friend who mom had passed away 10 years prior. She had told me some of these things, and I was like, okay. So you kind of have some ideas, but one advice that she gave me, was to write everything down in terms of what your dad or your mom or your sister or whomever it is that's, dying. Write down those moments where they say something special to you, or reach out and grab your hand and just tell you, I love you. I'm so proud of you. I did it a little bit. Now, I wish I would have done it more so, like in the moment, just hold on. I'm going to jot this down, because you think that you'll remember, but you don't.
Right.
And I was able to look back on my phone, on my notes, and just say, okay, this day my dad hugged me, told me that he loved me, or, said something to me. So if you don't write those things down, even if it seems silly at the moment, you won't remember. And looking back on it is all you're going to be able to have to remember.
That's such good advice.
So exactly. And so I did take that from her, bless her heart. I'm so glad she gave that to me. Because it did help me able to because, before they're almost comatose, they're conversing with you, you're having these conversations. And I felt very blessed to be able to have my dad tell me, I love you. I'm so proud of you. Those types of things. The other thing about journaling, hold on, I just lost my train of thought.
That's okay.
Oh my gosh.
It will come back around.
It'll come back. Yeah. Oh, I was going to say also, when they get to the point where they're not talking as much, write down the words that they say.
Yes.
Because you might not know if that is the actual last words they're going to say. Like the last thing my dad actually said to me was, it was Friday, and mind you, timeline, he died on Monday. So it was Friday mid-morning. He was standing up. He was just not comfortable. We were kind of holding him up at this point, my mom and I. And I kept telling him, Dad, you have to sit down. This is not safe. You either have to sit in the recliner or you have to lay in your bed. This is not safe. And my dad is 6'3". I'm 5, 5 if I stand up really tall. And, so I'm like holding him up, and it's hard because he's kind of floppy, right? He's not, holding all of himself up. And I was like getting mad. I'm like, Dad, you have to sit down. I'm going to call the nurse to come in here and tell you to come sit down. And he was like, you know what, Lay? They would always call me Lay or Lay as a nickname. He says, you just worry too much.
Oh.
And I'm like, okay, that's fair, Dad, except you're worrying me. I'm afraid you're going to face plant onto the ground. I'm barely able to hold you up. So writing stuff like that down where you think it's inconsequential, ironically, after that, he didn't say much more.
Right.
So sometimes we could get a yes or no from him, like when we would ask a question.
Yeah.
And I vividly remember the last thing he physically said. Now, my mom might have a different story because she was there through the nights, right? And I wasn't. But it might have been Sunday before he died. I don't think it was Monday morning, because by Monday he was pretty out of it. But I remember my mom saying, you know how much we love you. And I know how much you love me. And he breathed out and said, yeah.
Oh.
So so those types of things, you're going to want to record that, because you think in your head, oh, I'm going to remember, I'll remember it.
Right.
But the whirlwind that comes after somebody dies, you don't remember those things, even though you hope that you will.
Yes.
And I'm not saying that everyone won't remember every little thing, but if you can write them down and just date it, like this day, this time,
beautiful.
It really makes it more special to look back on those moments.
That is really beautiful.
So
I love that. I love that. That's part of the reason I want to do this, because I think people do come out of these experiences with lessons of, somebody else tells you something and you take their advice, or you've got your own advice, to share with someone, that it makes it just, a tiny bit easier for somebody else, or something that they wouldn't have thought of doing that means so much to them later.
Yeah.
Yeah. I just want you to tell I remember, I think that you were there when your dad died, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. Your mom was not in the room though.
Yes.
Yeah. Your mom, who had stayed there all the time.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So Monday came around, and I actually, going back to that Monday morning, so my mom sort of had a breakdown on Sunday night, where she maybe it was Saturday night, might have been Saturday night, where she didn't want to stay at the hospital anymore. She's sleeping in this recliner.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not comfortable. You're drained. You're tired. You're not doing anything but sitting there. I mean, it's very exhausting.
Yes.
It's very draining. It's very exhausting. And so she just kind of had this breakdown, and she was like, I'm the worst wife. I just can't stay another night. Anyways, I was able to take her home. She got a shower, and we came back, and then she was able to rally.
Yeah.
Well, I had my breakdown the next night. It was Sunday night. I was like, I can't do this anymore.
Yeah.
How long is this going to take? And I think I had been texting you at that point, and I was like, how long is this going to take? Like, I can't fathom a person living longer, but is this going to be another several days? Because he also wasn't exhibiting other symptoms of the actively dying phase, right? And I'm thinking, oh my God, this could be 3 more days. And when you're in the throes of it, 3 days is forever. It feels like forever.
Yes.
Now, looking back, I'm like, gosh, it was only 3 days. But no, when you're sitting there, the minutes feel like weeks.
Yes.
And the hours just feel like months. It just feels like time is stopping.
Absolutely.
Which is another thing that's that I found very interesting, was at that moment, I never wanted time to speed up and stop at the same time.
Yes.
I wanted it to be over. I wanted all of this waiting, and I mean, it was painful to be there watching, and I would never want to be any other place. But I wanted time to speed up, so it was over.
Yep.
But I didn't want it to be over, because then it was over.
Yes.
And then I was never, ever, ever have my dad. Now, mind you, he's laying there. He's not responsive.
But that is the way your brain works, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So
yes.
I found that was one of the most, I don't know, momentous moments of wanting time to speed up, but I'm wanting it to stop at the same exact time. It was like my brain couldn't handle that thought. Like, how does it want to speed up and stop at the same time?
Yeah.
But yeah, so Monday morning, so Sunday night, I have this breakdown. I'm like, I can't do this. And I'm like, I'm calling my husband. I'm bawling. I just am so tired. I'm physically drained, emotionally drained. And it was definitely, it was hard. So then the next morning, I walk into the hospital, and I'm like, oh my God, he's still alive. How is this gonna, why is he not dying? And I think I texted you multiple times that day too about it. And you just kept telling me, it's just like labor. It won't last forever. Okay. The baby's going to come out. You're going to have a baby, but it won't last forever, but it does feel like that.
Yes.
And so, my brother had been there most of the day. And my dad's breathing pattern had changed a little bit.
Yeah.
But not enough to warrant like the nurses and everybody are like, oh, this is it. You know, they were like, yeah, there's just some changes. That just means, you know, things are progressing. I mean, we would actually just check his O2 sensor. You know, we'd hook up the O2 just to see where it up. And he still had great oxygen.
Yep.
His pulse was a little bit lower, but not by any means. So
I checked both my parents' pulse so many times.
And you think, okay, it's got to be low. No, it was
just beating away.
Yeah. It was going along.
Yep.
And so things had kind of changed. And later that it was towards the night, I was trying to decide, you know, whether I should go home. But then at the nurses were changing their shift and they were doing, you know, like they'd come in and they're the report and do all that. And my dad kind of let out kind of a gasp. It was kind of a, you know, a breath.
Yeah.
And the nurse was like, that's new. And so we got this nurse. Anyways, the nurse that was going to be handed over, I think she was like, oh, hell no. He's going to die. I'm not doing it. So then they had to get a different nurse. Anyways, they were doing the transitions. And, you know, we were like, okay, he's making a gas. And so we're trying to guess, like, is he in pain?
Right.
At that point, he was on pain medication and Ativan, which is, I don't know, is that like Valium? IV Valium?
I mean, it's
like a sedative type
to calm the nervous system.
Yeah. And so he was on lots of that. And so we actually, as his family members, we had free reign to just request whatever we
Absolutely.
Want.
Yep.
So we were like, I think he needs more pain meds. Now, obviously we didn't want him to be like overdose, but the thought did cross our mind, like how bad would that be? Right. I mean, seriously, people, like this is terrible. Which you and I had talked about, like we almost treat our pets better.
We do. We absolutely do.
I worked in veterinary medicine and I cannot tell you how many euthanasias that I attended with the family. And it was so much more peaceful than just watching our loved one.
Waste away,
dehydrate away. And turn into a nothingness of a person. And so that, you know, brings its own thoughts along with that.
And you had mentioned to me, we had talked about this before, that you have a Christian background and like death with dignity was not necessarily something that you considered to be something you were necessarily like, you weren't going to do it for yourself. You weren't really, you know, didn't really think it was the greatest thing ever, but that has sort of changed a little bit in your head.
It absolutely has changed. And for that reason I don't see how that is different than like my dad making the conscious choice to go off all the fluids and all the TPN. I mean, one could argue, well, he chose to stop living because he went off fluids.
Yes.
And so you're splitting hairs when you're trying to decide whether doing something like with a death with dignity is applicable. And yes, it did change my mind in more favor of that. Now, I think every situation is different, and I would
100%,
never want, you know, to say, oh, just go out, you know, you're diagnosed with cancer. That's it. But it gets to the point where you know your body is dying. And my dad ultimately did choose to go off of the TPN. He could have continued on it. I mean, what would have happened is his bowels would have ruptured. But it absolutely could have been, you know, he could have continued on that. So he did make the choice to stop. And accepting the fact that, okay, my body is dying. My body is dying. This blockage is not going to open up. And by choosing to stopping doing that, you're not negating the fact that God still could heal you. You know, you don't need to give God another day. Right? He's either going to do it or he's not. And it obviously was my dad's time to go. But it did change my thinking on that. And I'm definitely more in favor of it.
Isn't that fascinating? Just, you know, we experience things in life and we can't always know how we truly feel about something until you've experienced it firsthand.
Exactly. You have to have that perspective, right? You don't have the perspective unless you're in the throes of it. And again, making a decision to allow, you know, your body's dying. You're just allowing it to die. Quicker. And again, like I said, I've
and it's not an easy process either. I mean, the death with dignity process is not simple. And so it's not as though, you know, it's still more complicated than what we do for animals. You know, So yeah, I mean, this is the thing about going through something like this, right? It can change our perspective on a lot of different things.
Yeah.
And sorry, I got you on fun. I took you.
No, and I'm glad.
You know, yeah. So your dad, it's Monday.
Yeah.
Brother had been there. You had your breakdown Sunday night.
Yeah.
Your mom's still there.
Yes.
Things are progressing. The nurse had come in. You had nurse shift change, so they brought a different nurse in. Okay.
Yeah. And so actually once all that happened, it was about 7. I think my brother had gone home, I want to say 4 or 5-ish or something like that. And, we were just kind of, because there had been some breathing changes, but they were all within the normal that, yes, okay, this means that we could go on for another day
right.
or 2.
Yeah.
And so basically once the shift change happened officially, we had requested some more Ativan given to my dad just to calm things down because we were like, we don't know.
Yep.
And then I remember we asked the nurses to come in because we weren't sure, like, should we give him more pain meds?
Right.
And they were very much like, I think that looking back now, I think they were concerned that if they gave another dose of pain meds, that would be it. He was going to die.
Yeah.
But we also were trying to be like, we don't want him to be in pain.
Yes.
We don't know if he's in pain. And so they were, explaining to us, well, his brow's not furrowed. Our body does things involuntarily to indicate pain. And he wasn't exhibiting those things.
Right.
And so we had, I think we requested a half dose of the pain meds, and we had already requested the Ativan, whatever, the IV Valium or whatever have you. And so, I called my brother and I was like, hey, there's some changes. Now this is like 7:30 or whatever. And there was definitely some more breathing changes, and the breathing would come in, and every time we would be leaning, think like, is he going to breathe out? And then he would breathe out. And we're okay. So I had called my brother and I was like, oh, hey, bro, just heads up. I think, there's just some changes. I'm not going to leave to go home because I was going to go home and then I was going to come back and stay the night there.
Yeah.
Because I just thought things are changing. I'm just going to be here with mom.
Right.
And anyway, so, this kind of keeps going on. I think at that point, they were giving him all the regular meds that he was on at that point. And it was like 8:00 and definitely breathing changes. And he was making more like gutturally sounds, like, definitely vocaling something has changed.
Yes.
So when he started making those sounds, I was like, no, we absolutely are going to request some more pain meds. I'm like, I don't care if it's what does him in.
Right.
I want him comfortable. And it was very peaceful. I had some soft, some of his favorite Christian music playing in the background.
Yeah.
And so, I don't know, 8:15 was rolling around, breathing. And mom and I were holding each hand. I was on one side, she was on the other. At that point, I called my brother and I was like, you better get here. I felt like something had shifted. I'm like, I don't know. His breathing has changed. And something else that had changed was the NG tube that was sucking out contents. The contents turned to blood.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So I was like, there's something happening. So my mom, she's like, okay, I'm just going to go to the bathroom. I'm going to go to the bathroom. So I'm sitting there, I'm holding my dad's hand and I'm just telling him that I love him and it's okay to let go. And I'm like, just go be with Jesus. It's okay, Dad. My mom goes to the bathroom and I'm holding my dad's hand and he takes a breath in and I'm fully expecting a breath out. And then there's no breath out.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, okay. And I'm like looking at my dad and I'm like, put my hand on his chest to see, okay, is there a breath going to come out? Because the breath was, in and there was, I fully expected an out breath.
Yeah.
Nope. And so then I'm like, okay. And it kind of like, not funny, but it just, you expect it to feel different,
Yeah.
And I'm like, so I go and I like feel for his pulse. There's no pulse.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like feeling on his wrist. I'm like, okay, there's no pulse. And my mom walks out of the bathroom and I'm like, Mom, Dad's gone. And she's like, what? She's like, are you sure? I'm like, okay, well, I just took his pulse. I'm pretty sure. And I was like, he took a breath in, but then there was not a breath out. And she's like, what? And she rushes over and she's feeling for a pulse. And I was like, I'm like, Mom, I think he's gone. And so I had, anyway, so then I immediately called my brother and I said, Dad's gone. And they were already on their way.
Sure.
But they were staying at like a hotel or like a Airbnb with some friends there. So they were like an hour away.
Okay.
So they were on their way and I'm like, okay, well, Dad's gone. And, then we call the nurse and, they have to take two people have to confirm that he's dead.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I was there holding my dad's hand. My mom would be. So
there's something really powerful about, situations like that, right? Like your dad, he just wanted your mom not to be there when he took his last breath. Like he didn't want that for her, right?
Yeah.
That he, and she took that opportunity to go to the bathroom. He was like, great. And I mean, it's just, there's so many stories like that, right?
Yeah.
So many stories. So I loved that story when you told it to me.
And, and my mom, she was like, what? And then she was like, of course, so now she's talking to my dad, but of course you would go when I have to go to the bathroom. And we were kind of joking.
Yes.
And what people I don't think understand is you have shed all your tears.
Right.
You have said your goodbyes. Every time I walked out of that hospital room, even if it was to go to the cafeteria, I said my goodbyes because I didn't know if that was going to be my dad's last breath. So every time we left the room, we would say intentional goodbyes.
Yeah.
I love yous, final things because we didn't know if that was going to be it.
Yeah.
So when the nurses come in, they're like, I'm sorry. And we're like, it's okay. And so we're just like packing up because
we're like, we're out. We're going to go now. Yeah.
We've been there. And now it was almost a relief. There was this relief of,
yes,
we don't have to stay another night in the hospital. My dad is at peace.
Yes.
Because at that point, those last 3 days, that was not living. That was,
oh no.
That was, you're drugging your loved one.
Yes.
You're medicating them out into like oblivion, essentially.
Yep.
That's not living.
Right.
And that's not how, my dad definitely didn't want that.
Yeah.
And so we're just kind of like packing up and then we're like waiting for the nurses and my brother and Melissa come in and, we're not crying at this point.
Right.
Because now the tears did come.
Of
we
course
got
they
home.
did. Yeah.
They did.
Yeah.
But at that moment, it was like it was the pinnacle moment of what we had been waiting for. We've been waiting for this moment.
Yes.
And the fact that it came and it was very peaceful.
Yes.
And it was just this, I don't know. It felt surreal.
Yeah.
It felt like we've been waiting for this moment for so long.
Yep.
Here it is.
Yep.
Now we're just going to pack up and go home.
Yeah, we're done. We're done with it. The experience is over. Yeah. And the credits are running,
Exactly.
Yeah.
And because we had already, all the preparations had been in order, my mom did ask the nurses, she's like, so now what happens? And they were like, do you really want to know? And she's like, yeah, I want to know.
Yeah.
And so she, because she's a nurse and just wanted to know. And they're like, okay, well, you've selected this company. So basically, we're going to take, Dave's body. And they were respectful. They weren't, they like, we're just going to take him down there. And they were like, but, we pretty much, have to, put him in a little bag and we put him in, cold storage. And then the company that you've, are going to use for the cremation, they're going to come pick his body up. And that'll usually be, the next day or two, depending on, the rounds essentially.
Right.
And so my mom's like, okay. And she's like, well, and then how do you make sure that you don't mix up his body? And so she's like asking these questions.
I love that so much.
So she's just like, and they're like, well, we make sure that there's several identification tags on, on Dave's body to, make sure. And then the bag is identified anyway. So she's
I would be the same way. I would want to go down there. I'd be like, I'm just going to go with them and I'll just wait.
Make sure.
Yeah.
And so I think that kind of, even though it seemed funny asking about like, what are you going to do with his body? Because my dad's not there anymore.
Right.
And once he died, it was very much, he's not there. It felt like he was not there anymore. Yeah. And even when my brother came in, and we're kind of like packing up and we're talking to the nurses about what they're going to do and the protocol, mom goes, oh, I'm sorry, Garen, Garen and Melissa, do you need some time? And my brother was like, okay, bye, Dad's body. Yeah. Because it wasn't my dad. Yes. It wasn't our dad anymore. It was just the vessel that he was in.
Exactly.
And so, we had said all those goodbyes. We had said all those intentional I love yous. We had said all the things that we wanted to say before that moment. So
Right.
at that point, there was nothing more to say to a dead body that was
Yep.
laying there.
Yep.
Now, if somebody felt like there was more that they wanted to say, I say do whatever feels right. But
Yes.
we were able to have all those conversations way
Beforehand.
before,
Yes.
beforehand.
Yes.
And so, and then we went home, and it was a very like, now what?
Mhm.
And then you go into just planning mode, right?
Yes.
You're waiting for the cremation, all the paperwork. You can't, it takes several days to get a death certificate, and then then you're just start the planning mode.
Right.
You've got to do all the bank account stuff and all of that, and so then there's this process, and so you don't even really have time at that point to let death actually in your head.
Yep.
So you're in this planning mode,
right?
And
you had his service a few weeks later on his birthday, correct?
Yeah. So he died on August 19th. And when we were looking at weekends to do his service, it just happened to be on the 21st. I was like, Mom, oh my gosh, that's his birthday. We have to plan it. Because we were going to do it like 2 or 3 weeks later. And I think it ended up being a little over a month. But it worked out to have it on his birthday. So it was a Saturday on his actual birthday. And it was a great like celebration, right? Yes. We were able to celebrate him. Yes. But it was.
So it's February now.
Yes.
And I think that we could probably spend another in fact, I'm sitting here thinking, well, now I'm going to have Leanna on and we're going to talk for 2 hours about her grief process. But I think, because of the experience you went through and the way you went through it, I'm not saying that your grief, that you haven't experienced any grief, because of course you have. But you had this really lovely opportunity to say goodbye. Yeah. And you had a lot of anticipatory grief. Now, I really believed I had grieved my mom, because I was like, oh no, I've done this. I've grieved her. We went through, my experience was 7 months from her diagnosis, but I was like, we've grieved her. I have grieved her. She's going to die. And I'm going to be like, okay. And then she died. And I was like, uh-oh. Anticipatory grief is not the same as actual grief after somebody dies. Yeah. And so, it has been 6-ish months for you. What's your experience with grief? What's it been so far? Because it's very new still. It's going to evolve still. Yeah.
Well, I think you explained it very beautifully when you were explaining the process to me, and explained it to me like I was 5. It comes in waves. Yeah. It really does. Yeah. I think some of the cruelest things that will happen is a thought will come across your head and you're like, sweet, I'm going to call my dad or my mom or I'm going to call them and tell them about whatever random thought you were thinking of. And then you literally pick up your phone and are like, what the heck? This is, and then it brings this, well, I know that he's gone. Why would I think that? And then
it's so powerful, right? Yeah. That our brain, you've had your dad in your whole entire life. Yes. So why would we expect that we're just going to remember every single moment that they're not here anymore, right?
Exactly.
It takes a while for a brain to, I think I told you this story too, that I was calling my dad every single night when he was alive. And after he had died, it probably took 3 or 4 months before that. It was at 7:00 every night that I'd call him. And at 7:00, my brain would be like, don't forget to call dad. And every night I'd go, why do we have to keep doing this? Yeah, but it's muscle memory.
It is. Yeah. And so those types of things happen. And then, I think what's helped the most for me in terms of knowing my mom is doing really good.
Good.
Like my mom is doing really well.
Good.
And, she misses him. Of course, there's definitely times where she misses him. Yes. But she was pretty much housebound with my dad, towards the end. Yes. They would go to church, but a lot of times, even towards, the June hospitalization and through July, he just wasn't able to do as much. The pain was pretty significant. Yep. And so, she was, didn't want to leave my dad, and rightfully so. Not that I'm saying that she should have gone out to
But it is a real thing for the caregiver. And when they don't have to do that anymore, she can actually live now.
Yes. Yeah. And that's what she said. She said that she felt like she got her life back.
Yeah.
And so she was able, so she's been able to, I think, do the things because she's a very outgoing social person, definitely an extrovert. And so she's been able to do all the things that
Yes.
she wasn't able to do
Yes.
because she just wanted to be there with my dad. And
Yeah.
I just, she literally set the bar like way too high.
Which is a lovely thing for you to not have to worry about her.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes.
Exactly. So that does help. And there would be times where I was having a really hard day and I would call my mom and she'd be like, "Oh, I'm so sorry you're having," and I'm like, "Mom." So it was funny because she would be the one just, like, "I'm sorry," and she's doing okay.
And it is a different experience. Not that it's easier for either of you, but yeah, she lost her husband, you lost your dad. Those are two very different experiences, right? Two very different relationships.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying, I mean, obviously your mom and dad were together forever, and I'm sure she's grieving. But I think that point of her spending the last 2 to 3 years of her life feeling very much like she couldn't leave your dad, and as I think the point that you made about her being an extrovert is really important. I mean, if you're an introvert, maybe that's not as big of a deal, but when you are an extrovert, it's a huge deal. And so she needs her people around her. That's how she is going to grieve.
Yeah.
Is being around people.
Yeah.
So I'm glad she's
Exactly.
doing that.
Yeah. So that's good for her. But so what does grief look like? Yeah, I'd say it comes in waves. Sometimes it's just random where you miss them or things will spark a memory and or think about something that you haven't thought about in a long time from like your childhood or whatever.
Yes. Yeah.
I still like in my head, like I just never ever fathomed not having my dad. I never imagined what it would like not being having a parent.
Right.
So I never ever, I mean, obviously we explored those thoughts when we knew he was dying, but it's still, you can prepare and plan and you think what it's going to look like, but
until it happens.
I feel like my kids are young. I just never imagined them not having their their papa.
Yeah. Yeah.
And for their whole lives, and 70, I don't feel like is old.
It's not.
And so that is kind of hard to wrap my brain around where I think like I just never not imagined not having my dad around.
Right.
And going over to visit my mom now we'll just say instead of I'm going to mom and dad's, I'm just going to mom's, that type of stuff. I miss him terribly, but I still feel very grateful for the time that we did have, because my husband lost his dad very suddenly when he was 20.
Right.
And there was no goodbyes. There was no planning. There was no life insurance because he was young in his 40s.
Yeah.
And so I do feel like we were blessed to have those times because we got to talk about things that, like we got to get things out in the open, like, talk about childhood stresses or things that you feel like you should talk to your parent about sometime.
There is some beauty in that, right? I mean, I've had this conversation lots of times with people about, is it better to die fast or die slow? Is it better for the family, for people to die fast? And I don't think there's a yes or no to anything like that, right? But I think to your point with your husband, there's some trauma in a more sudden death that comes. And there's not trauma in a long death either, but it's different. And it does shape the grief process a lot of times for people when you have to suddenly grieve.
Yeah.
Like we said, anticipatory grief and grief after someone has died are very different, but there is that preparation of anticipatory grief when you are working with someone as they are dying, and there is that gift, if you have it with a family member, where you can say goodbyes and process through a lot of your things. And so I think that because my impression with you, and obviously I don't live with you and I don't see you every day, but is that you've been doing this really beautifully, like allowing yourself to just feel what has come in. And it's been 6 months, like I said, I probably wouldn't have somebody on talking about grief at 6 months because sometimes that's just, they can't even talk about it yet, it's going to be different in 6 months from now and a year from now. You're going to go through that whole process of the year anniversary coming up, in 6 months, and his birthday, and all of those kind of things are going to be powerful days. And the fact that you're walking through them, you're going to do those too. You just are. Is there anything that, I feel like you gave such good advice today. And so, this was beautiful, Leanna. It was
Aw.
just beautiful. And I know that, you were a little nervous. I was a little nervous. It's the first episode. This was beautiful. It was such a gorgeous story of one, your dad and his experience, but also yours, Is there anything that you feel like you want to make sure you say before we close this today?
Yeah. So when you asked me that question before the podcast, I feel like I covered
You
a lot.
did. You covered a lot.
I would say, don't be afraid to research what it looks like to die, the dying process, and really inform yourself, because when you take the fear out of it, I don't know, fear can have just such a grip on us. And if you don't let it have its power, then you're able to be in that moment. So, that was, I already touched base on that, but I really feel strongly about making sure you journal those moments, not just what they say, but what they do, their actions. Like,
I think that's such
extra,
such an incredible piece of advice.
Exactly. And, if you're not near your loved one that's passing away, maybe just journal a little bit about that visit, even if they don't pass away for 6 months.
Right.
But you can look back on those moments and, really, relinquish all those moments and just remember how special that was. And because you do tend to forget. Yeah. I ended up losing years and years of photos off my phone. It was a complete bad thing that happened, and somehow they weren't backed up to my Google account.
There's grief right there too.
And actually there is, because I had so many pictures of over the last, I lost the pictures about a year ago. Yeah. And so from when he first got diagnosed, I had so many pictures with him and the kids and all that. And that stuff is, so I would make sure, take those pictures and make sure you get, save them.
Back up your phone.
Back up your phone and just make sure you have those memories, because when you do look back on pictures, you're able to see, it'll spark your memories as well. Oh. And then I'm thinking one other thing is, just when they are dying, it won't last forever. It really won't. Yes. It feels like it, and you will beg and pray that they don't last as long as they do, but it does pass, and you will look back, even though you're in the throes of it, and think it's never going to end. It does end, and there is something beautiful about being with your loved one as they're passing away. And I like to think, my parents were there with me when I entered the world, and so to be there when they exit the world, I think is a gift that it should be celebrated and not, just scoffed away or shunned and not talked about, because you can't have life without death. You just can't.
Yep. Oh, Leanna, this has just been incredible. I hope that after we shut this off today, that you take a little time for you. I know you've got, family and, you've got a life ahead of you, but this was a lot for you to be able to walk through and share. And so I do want you to take really good care of yourself the rest of today. And I just want to thank you again for agreeing to do this. I know we both had some nerves about it, and I think it's just another wonderful thing we got to share together. And I really do want to have you back in a year and talk about what that process has been like for you as, 18 months goes by after your dad has died. And, so I'll look forward to that conversation. I'm sure you and I will talk more between now and then, but
we will. I absolutely am looking forward to that. Yeah. And I really appreciating you giving me the opportunity to share and just converse with you about it. And
this is incredible. I think it's got so many great gifts to give to other people who listen to this. So thank you for sharing that with us. And thank you for sharing your dad with us. I think that it's just a wonderful story, wonderful experience to be able to share it like this, even in it's a difficult process, right? But you walked us through this just beautifully. So thank you very much for doing this, Leanna. I appreciate it.
Thank you again. I appreciate you having me.
All right. We'll talk again later.